Talks, sponsored by Manningham Council. Today's session is about super and retirement, which we know is a really hot topic at the moment. My name is Annette Rudd and I'm the project lead for Women's Financial Independence at Women's Health East. For those of you who may not be aware of Women's Health East, we are the regional health promotion agency for women in the eastern region of Melbourne. So I want to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this session on the lands of the Wurundjeri tribe of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I want to acknowledge any First Nations people listening in today from around the country. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. My behind the scenes co-host is Rachel from Women's Health East, and she'll be checking in on any questions you have as we go along. So just a quick note on how we're going to run the session. We'll be inviting questions as you listen to our discussion with our guest expert, Sue West, who I'll intro in a minute. And we also have some questions that have been pre-submitted. Good on you, that's fantastic. And I'll put those forward to Sue. But we want you to feel free to ask questions of Sue while we're chatting. So if you want to do that, please pop it in the Q&A box and Rachel will keep checking that. And then at the end, we will get to your question. We've left some time to make sure all questions get answered. And you have a great resource here in Sue. So it would be lovely if you feel like doing that. We also make recordings of these webinars and we'll make that available for anybody that's registered, and you'll receive an email about that after the event with the link. So today we're talking about women in super, and specifically how to make the most of what you have for retirement. And we know that super is a really big issue now with talks of funds falling and people are concerned for their retirement. Also, we've had the ability to take funds out of super for financial hardship reasons. So if you are struggling at the moment or feeling a bit overwhelmed, Rachel is going to put a list of helpful numbers that you could have at hand in the chat box. So check that out. So following on from that, a bit of a disclaimer that the information in all of these sessions is general in nature and that these sessions are designed to empower you with confidence to make some good financial decisions. But if you need financial advice, then you're best to contact a person who's qualified to give you that advice. So why this topic? Well, as you probably are aware, super is the major form of retirement savings we have in Australia. In fact, it's worth over $500 billion. Within that, women have less super than men. So in 2017 to 18, women had 31% less super available to them at retirement. And if you're nearing retirement or you're thinking about it in the next 10 years or so, chances are you haven't spent your whole life, your whole working life accruing super, because the Superannuation Guarantee only came in 1992. And as women are also likely to have years out of the workforce, having kids, which also impacts the super, there's also the fact that in terms of gender equity, we're still a way off. We're still earning less than men. So all these things compound to mean that we have less super. But the good news is, and there is good news, that women from their 40s and up are actually understanding the problem with lower super balances and are making more voluntary contributions than men these days. And I think the other really good news is that we have an amazing guest speaker here today who is all over this topic. And I have experienced firsthand a couple of sessions with Sue, and I can say she gives some really practical, fantastic advice. So she will help us with whatever amount of super we have, get the most out of it. So let me introduce Sue to you and I'll tell you a bit about her. Sue is a financial literacy expert with over 30 years experience in the financial services sector, including 15 years as a financial planner. Sue's seen a wide variety of money struggles encountered by both women and men. In her past work as a financial planner and a super specialist, she met many people who had walked away from advice because they felt intimidated by it. I can certainly relate to that. There are also dozens of others who felt someone would think they were silly for asking a question to clarify a complex point. These people are the reason that Sue founded financial literacy education and mentoring business called Money Natters, and that's Natters with an N. Sue is on the mission to empower people who come to a roadblock in their financial journey, not to walk away, but to jump to it and gain momentum. So welcome, Sue. We are so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Annette. Pleased to be here.
And I just wanted to start with a really general question. Now, we had quite a few questions pre-submitted, which was awesome. So I want to start with one, which is, can you just explain a little bit about what super is?
And that's a very good question. So superannuation is a vehicle for you to put money into to save for your retirement. So that is the crux of the matter. When you put money into superannuation, the government is saying, we want you to put that away to save to help fund your retirement when you actually get there. Many people think, though, that superannuation is not what it is. So if I said to you, how did your fund go last year? You could say to me, terrible fund, I've got to leave it because it's just not performing. But the superannuation fund is just the company that actually manages your money. So it doesn't hold on to your money, it actually invests your money on your behalf. So when you put your money into, let's just say Australian Super, the biggest super fund in Australia, your money goes into Australian Super, and Australian Super hold on to the fees and the taxes that they're required to pay on your behalf, and then they actually invest that money into the investment markets in your name. So if for some very strange reason Australian Super went bankrupt, your money would still be safe because you would be in the investment market and not, your money's not with Australian Super. But superannuation, as I said, is a vehicle for you to actually put money into to save for your retirement.
Great. So here is another one that was submitted ahead of time that I think a lot of people worry about and get really concerned about. And there's always news stories that can kind of make you freak out about this. So how much super is actually enough?
Well, that is the 100-point question. You know, how long is a piece of string? And Ed, if I asked you what were your plans in retirement, and then I told you my plans in retirement, we would have very, very different plans, as do probably everybody that's on this broadcast today. So how much do you need for retirement basically works out backwards to how much do you want, how much do you think that you will budget for. So when you're looking at retirement planning, you actually should be sitting down and doing a budget and saying, well, what do I actually need for retirement? Some of you will want to buy a camper van and go around Australia. Some of you will just want to retreat into behind the gates for a few months, etc. So having said all of that, the Australian Superannuation Funds Association has put out a fantastic publication, which I only came past today, and it looks like this, and it is actually the Retirement Standard Detailed Budget Breakdowns. So it tells us that if you are a couple and you want to have a comfortable lifestyle, you'll need to have an income from your super or age pension of $61,000. If you are single, you'll need to get income of $43,000. So when you get those actual figures, you can then say, well, how am I going to get that money together when I retire? And one of the things that you will look at is how much super do you need? If you are an older woman like myself, you probably say, well, am I going to be able to access some age pension? Do you have any investments outside of super? Putting that all together, then that should tell you what you actually need. Now, the Money Smart website, which I think Rachel's going to let everyone know about, they've got some fantastic calculators within their site. One of them will be as a budget calculator, where you can calculate what you think your budget is. And then another calculator will say, if you need that much money, then this is how much money you need to accumulate. Bearing in mind what I just said, some of it will be probably superannuation, some of it will probably be, if you're my age pension, and some of it probably will be investments that you have outside of super. Now, as Annette mentioned, superannuation funds love telling you how much money you need, and there's many, many women here today that will be reading that you need $1.5 million, etc. What they're saying in that statement, in my opinion, is that you need $1.5 million to self-fund your retirement, so you're not going to access any age pension or any other investments, and that you need enough money for you to actually have money left over to leave your kids. So if you're like me, that I've given my kids everything while they're growing up, that I want to be able to have my money for spending in my retirement, then that's not a factor for me. So I know that in my retirement planning, I'm 3 years away. I am looking at nothing like that sort of money, and I'm going to have a comfortable retirement.
That, I reckon, is hugely relieving for a lot of people listening today, because I've certainly read those news stories where they tell you need $1.5 million. And, you know, if you want to be able to, I don't know, buy a camper van and go around Australia, like you said. And you think, well, that's not going to happen anytime in the next 10 years for me. So I think that's fantastic to hear that. That's really good. And I do like, I have used that Money Smart retirement income calculator. I think Rachel will put that in the chat if she hasn't already. And that's a really good one. And I'm glad to hear about this new one you found, Sue, as well. I think I'll get on later and have a look at that. It's, I think, all those things that we can do ourselves to actually understand what we are going to need. It gives you a sense of calmness and control. Whereas if you're just listening to the news at the moment, particularly with talk of, you know, falling super balances, it can be very easy to just feel a bit out of control around it. So thank you. I feel greatly relieved, and I'm sure some other women do as well. Another question that was pre-submitted is basically, when can you retire? I mean, I know there's the government age you can retire, and there's ages you can pull out your super. And so how does superannuation work when you're actually ready to retire or getting close to that age?
Okay, well, I'll go back to your first question. Can you retire? Annette, I give you permission, you can retire today.
Woohoo!
But you know what you have to do? You have to fund your retirement totally with money that's not in super, because you're too young to get it, to be able to get it. So anyone can retire whenever they like. Now, the word of retirement, well, what it basically means is you're going to stop work. So if you're going to stop work and not have money, you've got to find money from some other source. So this retirement, so to further on that, there's another date that you need to be aware of, which is called your preservation age. And that's the first jargon piece of information I've given you. So superannuation especially is full of jargon, which makes it seem like it's hard to understand, but I can guarantee you it isn't that hard to understand when you unjargon it. So your preservation age is the first age that you can actually access your super. So for anyone born before 1964, it's somewhere between 55 and 60. And everyone born after 64, it's age 60. So you can access your super at age 60, I would suggest, for the majority listening today. To actually access your super though, you need to have fitted a term of having retired. And so you need to have said to your super fund, I am not going to be working for my employer any more than 10 hours per week. And that's the definition of retirement. And if you've retired, you can then say to your super fund, I've retired. They actually release your money from being what they call preserved money to non-preserved money. And when it's non-preserved money, you can access it. So again, that's another date that you need to be aware of. But then we look at when can you actually get your age pension. So you can't get your age pension probably, I'm 60, just turned 64. I can't get my age pension now to 66 and a half. So several years ago, it used to be 65 flat for everybody, and the government changed those rules and said that from a certain age, from 1954 onwards, born 1954, you're going to incrementally go upwards to now the highest age is 67. I wouldn't mind betting that that's going to go to highest age being 70 eventually. So let's just work on my age, 64. I could have got my super I could have retired any time, but I couldn't fund it. I could have got my super when I was 55, but again, I couldn't fund retirement, so I didn't take it. So I can take my super anytime I like now because I've reached age 55 if I retire and let the super fund know. But then I have to wait for another 2.5 years to get the age pension. So with all of this stuff happening, you've got to time yourself. So if you want to retire earlier than your preservation age, first thing is you need to have money outside of super to fund that retirement. Then when you get to preservation age, if you want to retire, you can access your super and retire with your super, but then you have to wait another few years probably till you can reach age pension. So it's a bit complicated, but it isn't as long as you do the budgets that I've been talking about. If you budget yourself through that you know what you need, there's every possibility that you could retire at preservation age, have enough super to keep you going till you get to age pension, then go on to age pension to supplement your superannuation.
So I just want to pick up, because you said something I wasn't aware of, which is you can tell your super company what your retirement is going to be? So you can say, I'm retired and I'm working 10 hours a week. Is that correct?
You can sign a declaration to say that I am now within the range of retirement, or I have fulfilled the definition of retirement.
Oh, and so that can be variable around a certain amount of hours per week still working for the same company that you're with?
You need to have left that company.
Oh, okay. So it might be that you take 10 hours a week up working as a barista in a local cafe or something.
Correct. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Yeah.
And I will also say, just as a point of note, that once you let that super fund know that you have retired, as long as you're doing it legitimately, so, if you tell the super fund you have retired and you haven't, you could get picked up. So you don't want to put yourself in that situation. But once you've legitimately retired, you're told your super fund, it doesn't matter if you go back to work. So once you've told them and they make your money non-preserved money, that becomes non-preserved. So let's just say that Women's Health East, a month after I retired, said, Sue, come and work for me. And it's a job of my life, dreams. And I go and work for Women's Health East. I don't need to go back to my super fund and say, oh, by the way, I've gone back to work now.
And you can still have your superannuation payments go into your account from your new position?
Correct, you can. And those new contributions would go in and be preserved. And the balance that was there when you told them that you'd retired would be non-preserved, available for you.
Okay. Excellent. Well, moving on, there is another question from an audience member about super investment options, which I know is quite confusing for a lot of us. Our money is often deposited into a default account, which is balanced, but is this the best option? And a second part to the question, which I think is related, why does it go up and down so much, our super balances?
Okay. Well, if you're thinking about retirement, that is the ideal question to be asking. If you've never thought about it before, it's time to start thinking about it. And it doesn't matter whether you're going close to retirement or not and you're listening. It is fundamentally one of the most important parts of your super that you need to be aware of. As I mentioned before, when your money goes into the super fund, so into Australian super by law need to invest that money. So when you started in your super fund, you may or may not have been aware that you had the opportunity of choosing where your money was invested. So for my age and for people who are my age, we were actually put into funds by our employer. And when we were put into those funds, they just paid the superannuation off to the super fund. And we actually didn't really know what super fund we were in or understand the super fund for quite a long time. We would wait and we'd get a letter welcoming us to our super fund. And that parcel that we got would be a really big parcel, it would be overwhelming. We'd open it up and it'd say, welcome, Sue, you're now a member of Australian Super, this is your member number, blah, 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 blah. And then on about page 5, it'd say, by the way, we've actually chosen your investment option because we needed to invest that money and you need to tell us if it's a right or wrong option. And 80% of Australians weren't aware that you had to do that. And so they felt that they were being put into the option that the super fund chose and that was all they could do. But that's not the point, that's not the reality. The reality is that your money is invested for you and can be invested the way you would like it. So if you're in a balanced fund, and in fact, lots of super funds, actually their default fund is growth, which is even a higher risk fund. But if you're in a balanced fund or say a growth fund, about 70% of your money will be in higher risk investments, which is property and shares. And then the rest of the money would be in lower risk investments. Now, some people, when you're in a higher risk investment, you are going to have high risk, obviously, and risk means that returns are volatile, that you could get very good returns, but you could get very bad returns. And for the last 4 to 5 years, if you've been in the balanced fund, you've had happy days. You've been getting 10 and 11% returns, and that's fantastic. And that's really because you were put into the balanced fund. But now we're in COVID time, 1 week in the beginning of March, your fund would have dropped 20 to 30% in a week when COVID really hit. But if you look at your super fund now, you've probably actually made up all that money plus more because the market's rebounded. And the reason that that's happened at the present time is because the government's printing money and the money has to go somewhere. So it's going into the share market. And it's actually inflating the share market probably more than it normally would have been in COVID times. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that with your super funds, as long as you're not in a defined benefit fund, and for those people who are in a defined benefit fund, I really recommend you go and talk to your fund to understand that fund. But for everybody else, which is probably 90%, if not all of us on this call, you have the opportunity of choosing where your money's invested. So you need to invest it in an investment option that you feel very, very comfortable with. If you have a nervous breakdown every time the share market drops because you know your super's going to drop, then I would suggest that's probably not the right investment option for you. Because if you're in an option that gets you good returns, every now and then you'll have an equally bad return. And you need to be able to see that out and stay in that fund to let it return back to where it was and go beyond. If that's not the way you like to run your money, you need to think of something that's a little bit more conservative that will give you lesser return, but will be more non-volatile.
So, Sue, is there a kind of a time frame at which you would go from a more aggressive fund, heading towards retirement, when you would say, okay, I now need to be in something that's a bit safer? Is there sort of an amount of years that you would recommend people switch over?
I've worked with many, many people, and I would say that it is an often occurrence that as you get older, you become less aggressive. But I've got a 34-year-old daughter and a 30-year-old son, and my 30-year-old daughter is a really conservative young lady, and she has all her super fund and very conservative funds. She said, I just want to see it growing a little bit, Mum. I don't want to take any risks. Yet my son, he's really aggressive and he's got all his money in the share market. Then you will go to seeing older people like me, and they will have all their money in the share market because they say that they don't think that's aggressive because they've got all their shares in banks. And so within the share market, there's actually more aggressive and less aggressive shares within the share market, and banks are less aggressive, I suppose, because you get a steady flow of income and a steady flow of growth. So in answer to your question, some super funds have what they call age-based investment options. And so when you go in when you're young, you'll be in very aggressive. And as you get older, you will tone down to be less aggressive. But one of those problems that I see when you do that, and I don't say that that's the wrong option or the way to do it either, but the fact is that with superannuation doesn't stop the day we retire. Superannuation actually goes on till we die. So we've still probably got another 20 to 25 years in superannuation. So if you put your money all in cash when you retire, you'll expect to get a 3 or 4% return. You'll have a 3 or 4% inflation rate probably coming out of what we're going in. So your money's going to be eaten away by inflation, and you're going to be drawing down money for your income. So you've got to think about having some growth assets, some more aggressive assets to keep pace with inflation at least, and to last the whole time you're going to be alive.
Yeah, that does make sense, that you do need to consider, particularly women are living longer, that, if we're retiring in the 60s or 70s, whatever it might be, 50s if you're lucky, then you do have a considerable amount of years to plan for, and super needs to kind of get you through that. So I guess one thing that I was wondering then, in terms of how do you assess for yourself the amount of risk you're willing to take? Because it's one thing to look at your super fund and just go, I might be okay with this, or I might be okay with that option. But are there tools that you can use that will help you figure out exactly how much risk you're wanting to take?
Mm-hmm. So if you go onto your super fund, you can type in your super fund into Dr. Google. Let's just say it's Australian Super. You could go Australian Super risk profile or HESTA risk profile. And they've got a risk profile questionnaire that you fill in. And it kind of asks you questions like, how much money do you need? if your investments lost 10%, how would you feel? Do you understand what share markets are, etc. So it gets a feel of exactly how au fait you are with investing. And it then comes up with a score. And with that score, it tells you as an indicator. It's not completely factual because it's just a scoring thing, depending on how you feel on the day. But it will tell you what sort of risk you're prepared to take. And then that will correlate with the investment options within that fund.
That's great. So another question that I was just thinking about was, some of us are really interested in ethical investing. Is there a way that you can go into your super fund? I know I've been trying this a little bit recently to see what companies they invest in. I know some super funds will have an ethical investment option, but if they don't, do you have any recommendations around that for people?
So there is actually an ethical and superannuation fund that you can go into, or two, I think, out in the marketplace. Be aware that when you're going into an ethical fund, you will pay more in fees because they have to do a lot more research than just the normal funds to make sure that they are ethical. Within the normal superannuation funds, like the Australian Superannuation, Australian Super, Big Super, they would have a sustainable fund or an ethical investment option within their fund. Most super funds have the ability for you to actually inquire, so you can actually, through their inquiry function, find out what shares they're actually investing in at any one particular time. But bear in mind that the way the super funds make money for you is actually buying and selling shares, because most super funds don't buy and sit. The way that they can make more money for you is to buy better investments all the time. So they've got fund managers behind the scene looking at your investments or the investments they've got you in, making sure that they've got the best ones. But most super funds will tell you what the type of investments that they've got within their ethical funds. Can I tell you though, no one will have a fully 100% ethical fund, because even ethical funds invest in banks and banks lend money to non-ethical investments. So, but nevertheless, an ethical fund in its pure form is far better than being in a non-ethical fund. But I'll just tell you a little story that happened about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago. A woman was in, I think it was in Host Plus, and she was really quite concerned about how much coal mining shares their fund was in, or her fund was in. She started gaining momentum to a Facebook page and got so many signatures that she actually was able to influence her fund, which had millions of members, to actually sell out of coal-fired shares. So you think you don't have the power, but you actually do have the power, and people are so now concerned about the environment, etc., that you can actually start things. So if you did find that your fund was investing in coal mines, etc., you probably could get some sort of voice going to get rid of those out of your fund.
Well, that is an inspiring example. That's fantastic to hear that. That's power to the people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which you often don't feel when your money is invested in super. So in terms then, I guess, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between an industry super, which a lot of people will be in, and a non-industry super. You couldn't see, I don't think you're on view then, so you have to show people when you speak.
So industry super is the people that walk around with their hands cupped with each other. So that's a very good question also. So we have several sorts of super funds that you can be invested in, and the main common one is an industry super fund. So as Annette mentioned at the start, Superannuation Guarantee only came in 1992. And before that, people were either in government superannuation funds. So when I was a child, my mother said, go and work for the state government, go and work for the federal government. You can get great super, which I never heeded her advice, and now I wish I had it. But anyway, so in 1992, when Superannuation Guarantee came in, 80% of Australians weren't in superannuation. And anyone that was in superannuation was either in the government funds or in funds run by AMP, MLC, all those big named companies that you hear around the place. Paul Keating was really concerned about that, because there were people that were going to be paid superannuation that had no idea about investing, and they were very, very concerned that the bigger players like the AMPs, etc., will come in and they would mass sign up people to very, very expensive superannuation funds where they didn't actually need to be in those super funds. They needed to have just a small fund that had minimal options within it, minimal investment options, a small amount of insurance, and very, very low cost. So industry funds were formed, and they were formed by the unions depending on your industry. So in the day, every single industry had its own super fund. So you had Print Super, you had Cbus for the construction industry, you had Hester for the hospital employees, you had Host Plus for hospitality people, you had Print Super, you had blah, blah. So every single sort of industry had its own super fund. And it was part of your reward that when you went to work for a company, you had to go into their industry super fund. So that's why we often had 2 or 3 super funds, because when you went to a new employer, that you had to go and start into a new industry fund. They have remained, and they are now probably the biggest pool of superannuation money. They are still low cost. They still have a minimal amount of insurance, and they still have a smaller array of investment options, except probably Australian super. But what's happened with superannuation is regulations have grown and grown and grown, and compliance has grown. So some of the smallest industry funds have not had the ability to actually pay for all the compliance within their fund. So lots of industry funds have merged, and that's where Australian super has become the biggest fund, because a lot of industry funds have merged into Australian super, versus public offer funds. So public offer funds are still offered by the AMPs, MLCs, etc. And when you have a super fund that is run by those, and the banks are a public offer fund as well, they have a higher rate and higher fee that you have to pay, because you are offered a better amount of insurance and probably better terms in insurance, but you also have the ability to invest in far more investments than you were in an industry fund. Now, for 90% of us, you don't really need that sort of level of choice, because you probably don't understand the investment market at all anyway. So public offer funds seem to be far more expensive and don't give you really what you need, because you are not a very versed investor. I will also say that there is also another super fund you can have, which is a self-managed super fund, and that's where you choose to actually manage the fund yourself. But within an industry fund or a public offer fund, those funds are actually audited within the fund, and you don't have to worry about it. But with a self-managed super fund, you have to actually do a tax return for your own self-managed super fund. You have to do an audit on your super fund. So it costs you around about $5,000 a year to run that fund. So you need to have quite a lot of money in that fund to justify the fee.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So moving on to another pre-submitted question. What do we do if we're in our early 50s and have no or low super? It's obviously a very concerning situation for the person that's raised it. What's the best advice you can give, and any other women in that position?
So there's no time it's too late for you to start investing in superannuation. So when you say you've got no or low superannuation, I wonder if it's because you haven't been able to work, you might be on Centrelink, etc. You can only invest, or you can only save, you can only put money away if you can afford to put money away. So if you can't afford to put money away, then, and you have no or low superannuation, you just want to make sure that if you have got any superannuation, that you're managing it correctly, you understand where your money's invested, etc., and you look forward to getting onto the age pension. If you have the ability to put any money in superannuation, it's never too late to start. And as a start, I would recommend, if you're a lower income earner, so if you earn less than 36,000 up to about 50,000, you will be eligible for the government co-contribution, which is where if you put money into superannuation, the government will match it 50%. So if you put in a maximum of $1,000 a year, the government will give you a bonus of $500 a year. So that's if you're a low income earner earning under $36,000. To do that, you need to put contributions into superannuation, and they need to be after-tax contributions. So it is like getting paid and then saying, from my pay, I'm going to put money into superannuation. So you need to make sure it's that sort of contribution. So if you can't do anything else, if you can put the $1,000 in, or any part of $1,000 in, the government will give you 50 cents for $1 for every dollar you put in. So if you can only afford to put in 500, you'll get a bonus of $250. So that's the first thing to do. So first off, make sure the investment options are right. Second off, can you get the government co-contribution and put that amount of money in? And if you go onto the calculators in Money Smart and you say, this is what I've got, this is what I can put into, no, just say this is what I've got, what's it going to be when I reach retirement age, and then do another calculation of this is what I've got, and I'm going to be able to get the government co-contribution until I retire. You will be amazed, even if you're in your 50s, at the result that will have of putting that amount of money in.
I suppose that's the virtue of compounding interest in super, that even over 10 years, presumably 10, 15 years, you can really make that grow, can't you?
Absolutely. So for people who don't understand the term compounding, it's where you get interest on interest on interest. So if you've got $100 and you make, $1,000 and you make $100 this year, which is a 10% which you've made, then you go into next year, if you get 10% return, you're going to get 10% return on $1,100. So it's going to be a bit more. And then the next year, it's going to be $1,250 that you're going to get a return. So you're getting investment returns on the returns that you're getting, as well as the money that you've got in there. So that is one of the, if you want to have an eighth wonder of the world, it's compounding interest. It is a marvelous thing. And that's why the kids of today, the kids that are just starting out in superannuation at 25, and they're not going to be able to get it until probably they're 70, they are going to have millions of dollars in their superannuation, even if they do nothing. And it's all going to be because of compounding interest.
Well, that is positive. So you've sort of alluded to it in answering that question, but I know there's things we can do as we approach retirement to maximise our super savings, some bits and pieces and different schemes. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about those and how they work.
Sure. So if you have a partner who is a higher income earner and you're a lower income earner, then your partner can do a thing called a spouse contribution. So they're able to put $3,000, or they can put as much as they like in, but if they put $3,000 in, they'll get a $540 tax rebate from their next tax return. And basically a tax rebate is very different to a tax deduction. A tax rebate is that if they have to pay $1,000 tax at the end of the year, they'll get $540 taken off that tax. So that's a really great thing. So that's a spouse rebate. Your spouse can also do superannuation splitting and put money into your account. Now, with all of these things, you've got to make sure that you do understand what you're doing there, because ages make a difference and super balances make a difference, and there's a whole host of things that can make a difference. How much you're putting into super and how much they're putting in, there's limits, etc. But one of the greatest things you can do is when you reach your preservation age, I did say that you need to retire to actually access your super. You can actually, when you reach your preservation age, actually access your super with actually not accessing the money part, but you can move your superannuation into what they call a transition to retirement pension. And that's a pension where you can actually be drawing down money from your superannuation. You can't access the actual balance because it's still tied up. The money's still preserved, but you're able to access that balance, and you're able to draw down between 4 and 10% of your balance of super. When you do that, if you're a working person, that allows you to use that money to subsidise you doing salary sacrifice back into your super. And that actually has an ability for you to be able to be actually putting more money back into your super if you're in a 32.5% tax bracket and above, to be putting more money back into your super than you're actually taking out of your super. So it allows you to grow your superannuation in a better way. Now that strategy is actually, if you don't do it right, you'll actually end up paying more tax than you need to, etc. So you really do need to see somebody to actually help you start that strategy if that's something you'd like to do.
I think you can get that sort of advice from your own super fund, can't you? They will help.
Absolutely.
You need to pay for that, but they will help you figure out what the strategy could be for you.
Correct. I have heard that when people are reaching their preservation age currently, their super fund is sending out some correspondence saying, have you considered a transition to retirement strategy? And in that leaflet that you'll get, it'll give you examples of exactly how it all works, etc. And then you could just ring up your super fund and they won't actually advise you whether it's right or not. But what they'll do is, if you say, could you please just make sure that I'm saying the right thing? So you could go in and say, I'd like you to clarify that my understanding's right. And then they're able to do that with you.
Okay, and I think Rachel is going to put some of that into the chat box too, some of the links to those. One thing that I've read about recently that I wasn't aware of is downsizing, that you can put contributions to your super if you actually sell your house.
Correct.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So that was a couple of years ago that came in. And I mean, I'm a typical example of this. I'm an empty nester in a 4-bedroom house that's driving me insane because it's so hard to clean and so big to maintain. And I'll be downsizing when I retire. But I'm not eligible for the downsizer contribution, which I'll talk about in a sec, because you have to have owned your home for 10 years. And I've only owned this home for 6. So won't be eligible. If you've owned your home for 10 years, when you're putting money, I'll go back, so sorry to do this, but when you're putting money into superannuation, there's rules about how much you can put into super. So, and there's rules around the different types of contributions and different limits. So the rule that we're going to be talking about is putting in after-tax contributions into superannuation, putting personal money into superannuation. A good example of this is if you got an inheritance and you want to put in superannuation, you just put it in superannuation, but it has rules. And the rules are that you can put in $100,000 a year, but you can bring forward 3 years in one transaction. So if you had $300,000, you could say, right, I'm putting $300,000 in, which would take up 3 years of your $100,000 contribution. So that's what it does. So with the downsizer contribution, they're allowing you to put that contribution in and there's rules about the age. So if you're not working, you can't put money into superannuation, et cetera, if you're over a certain age. So if you are over that certain age, it allows you to put, both of you, $300,000 into your superannuation so that you've got it in a tax effective environment.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I am going to finish the formal questions with another pre-submitted question, and then we will get Rachel to give us the rundown on some questions that have been submitted, which is terrific, by the live audience. So another pre-submitted question is, should I be investing my savings in paying off my mortgage or growing my super? I bet you get asked that one all the time, Sue, and I bet it's really hard to answer.
So I'm running a retirement planning class at the minute, and that was asked last week. And so I can't answer it. So, but I'll tell you why I can't answer it. So the girls that I ran running the retirement planning asked the question, and I sent them a couple of articles. And when they came back, they said it's just such a hard thing to understand, and that is exactly right. So what we've got is that we are in the lowest interest rate environment that we've ever been in. And we've got the Reserve Bank governor telling us that he will not take it any lower. So we're stuck here, and when the interest rates move, they're going to move up. He's already said that to us. We've got that. We've also got a share market that is breaking all records. So you're making a heap of money in the share market, albeit that it is volatile. So I heard just before I came on that the market's dipped 1.9% today. So it's had a big drop in the morning for some reason or other. Probably Donald Trump sneezed or something, and we've had a market dip. So you'll have but you've got a really, really strong market out there. So the question was asked a little while ago, I'm in the balanced fund, should I be staying there or not? Because I'm in the default fund. So 80% of Australians are in default funds because they haven't been aware that they have an option to move their money. They think it's stuck there. So those people are making, probably 8%, 9% in a good year, and they're paying a really low interest rate for their mortgage. So some pundits, and I can't say whether either one's right. Some people say your money in your super is going to make much more money than the money that you're paying off your mortgage at this current stage. That may change eventually because the interest rates will go up, and it may well be that you can actually, on a consistent level, make more money by putting your money into your mortgage and paying that down. So if you're very close to retirement, one of the articles I gave to the girls the other day was, if you're close to retirement, perhaps having your money in the superannuation fund where you can get 8 and 9% is better, because you'll actually be able to pay off your mortgage with the extra money you've paid when you reach your retirement. The other side of the coin, though, is while the interest rates are really low, if you're putting much more money into super, into your mortgage, because the interest rates are so low, you're able to pay your mortgage off far quicker. And one of the greatest things that you can do when you go into retirement, if possible, is to go in without having a mortgage. And I know that this ASPA thing is talks of you going into retirement without a mortgage. So, it's either pay off your mortgage now by doing it quicker and then have your super, or putting your money into super and getting the extra money that you can get, and then paying off your mortgage. If your super's just in the cash option, then you're probably even Steven as to what you do. Now, in one of those articles, it did say that there was some information about all of this in Money Smart. Yesterday, I did actually try and search for that information and I couldn't find it. So I think that tells you something, that is such a complex situation. You'd have to be sitting down with your Excel spreadsheets, working out the fors and the against, and then the against and the fors on either side of the equation, and it really is a personal decision.
And it probably comes down a little bit to how much risk you want to take too. If you're comfortable to be in the share market at the moment, whereas paying down your mortgage is probably a really safe option, you might feel more comfortable to do that. So
absolutely, because the share market is volatile, and there's nothing to say that strategy to try and gain more money in the share market, in the superannuation, you may fall flat on your face. You may have been putting all this money away and you may lose, get a major drop. We don't know. But what we do know is at the moment, the share market is really quite, going quite well.
Okay, Sue, well, I know we have a number of questions from the audience who are listening. So I'm going to ask Rachel to unmute herself and let us know what people are thinking.
Hi, Annette. Hi, Sue. Thank you so much for having that conversation. It was certainly very informative for me. So we've got about 6 questions in total, and I know you've already responded to one of them. So I'm going to start with a question around what you've just been talking about. So, and again, I might need to maybe infer what this question is given how it's phrased. So it was in relation to the question on the super investment options and why does it go up and down so much, and the share market. And so the question is, will we see this inflated loss again with the government propping up the share market after COVID?
So, sorry, Rachel, would you just mind repeating that again?
Yeah, so the question is, so will we see this inflated lose or loss again with the government propping up the share market after COVID?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm not an economic expert, but the money has gone. So in pure economic terms, here I'm saying I don't understand economics, but I understand this part of it. In non-COVID times, there's a finite amount of money that is released by the Reserve Bank. So they don't print money just to stick into the economy in a lot of times. What happens is they have trillions of dollars, which let's just say it's $10 trillion within the economy. And the only time they really print money is when money gets torn and wrecked and needs to be replaced. So we have the $10 trillion running around the markets, and it has to land somewhere. So it'll land either in banks, in bonds, in the share market, or in property. So you might see the share market going really gangbusters, but then no money's in the bank. You might see the property market going really well, but the share market's not going well. And it's because this finite amount of money is rolling around the economy. At the moment, to prop up the economy, as you quite rightly say, the person who asked this question, we have got an inflated amount of money within the economy. don't think that, I'm not hearing, and I can't say this is 100% correct, but I'm not hearing that they're going to reduce the amount of money in the economy. They'll leave this amount of money in there, and then they'll just let it, eventually when they stop printing, they'll just let it just be the finite amount of money again. So that money has to go somewhere, and currently it's going into the share market, and it's probably going into the share market in several ways. The biggest investor in the share market is the Australian superannuation industry. So because not 80% of Australians are invested in a default fund, which is at least a balanced fund, probably a growth fund, about 70% of the money in the share market in superannuation is invested in the share market in Australia. So in answer to your question, the returns of superannuation funds are dependent on really great returns to the in the share market predominantly. So you would think that with superannuation happening and the 9.5% and the economy and the workforce starting to get back into place again and more money going back into superannuation, and next year they're anticipating it's going to go to 10%, not 9.5%, I would say that we wouldn't probably see a massive dive from the fact of the money being stopped. What I think will actually create some stirring is we've got a few big elections happening in the world at the minute, the one in America. I think that will create some volatility in the market, a big lot of volatility, especially if Donald Trump gets back in. We've got a New Zealand happening at the moment, so if Jacinda gets voted out, which is highly unlikely, but if she does, that'll cause some volatility. And we've also got some elections going around Australia in the state governments. So those sorts of things create volatility. I'm not sure that the stopping of the printing of the money will create as much volatility as those events.
Thanks for that, Sue. And actually, the audience member has clarified the question, but in the interest of time, I might come back to it because I think you've kind of addressed it. So the next question is from someone who is interested to know how much pension we qualify for in relation to the super we have.
So that's a very good question. So when you get to actually age retirement and you are eligible for an age pension, they look at all your assets and your income, and they do an asset and an income test. Now, I don't know the exact figures, but you can have somewhere around 800,000 if you're a married couple without a house, down to about 800,000 if you have a house, if you're a couple, and up to $1 million if you don't have a house. And again, these figures aren't correct. I know they're not right, but they're close. So you can look up these on the DHS Centrelink Age Pension website, and you can ask for what is your asset test limit and your income test limit. So that anyway, they look at all your assets, and they look at all your assets excluding your family home. When you reach pension age, they will count your superannuation as one of your assets. And they will also count any financial assets that you have as being producing some form of income for you. And they do a thing called a deeming test. And again, you need to have, for the sake of time, you need to look that up and understand it. So they look at your assets and income. And then if you are within those asset and income test limits, as a couple, you're eligible for $36,000 in age pension. And as a single person, you're eligible for $24,000. Clearly, if you're a single person, the asset and income test limits are around about half of what a couple is. So I hope I've answered that question, but there is, as I said, quite a lot of information on the Centrelink Age Pension website. And what you'll be looking at is the asset test limit and the income test limit. And I'd go on to the Money Smart site to understand what deeming means.
Thanks for that, Sue. I think that's really helpful, and we'll try and we'll try and include the links to the DHHS Centrelink website and the Money Smart website in our follow-up email.
Thank you.
So there's another question, and it's asking you to explain binding and non-binding beneficiaries in your super fund.
That's a very good question. So well done to the person who asked that question. So within your super fund, you may not be aware that when you die, your superannuation fund is not part of your willable assets. So when you die, you have a will, and if you haven't got a will, I encourage you to get one, because if you die without a will, it is actually quite half of the people you left behind. But in your will, you say, I'd like to give all my assets to Annette, for instance. So what that means is that when I die, Annette is eligible to have all the assets that I own, unless somebody obviously complains about that. That is everything but my superannuation. Within my superannuation, it is actually owned as an entity. So superannuation fund is owned as an entity with a trustee being the person who owns that fund. They don't own my investments because they're still out in the investment market, but they have the ability to determine where my superannuation goes. So if you have you can have no nomination at all. So if you have no nomination, when you die, your executor probably will go and say to the super fund, we'd like the money paid into the estate because we'd like to distribute this to the beneficiaries. What would happen then, the super fund would then go out to your spouse and your children to make sure that they are happy that that would happen. And then if you don't have a spouse or children, then it will go out to, then it goes to your parents and then to your siblings, etc. So it has a line of people that goes to ask about whether that's okay. You can then have a non-binding nomination, and that's where you say, if I die, I'd like you to give this money to X, Y, and Z, and you can have many people. By definition of them saying that that's a non-binding definition, what they do then is at that time, they have a look and see where those people actually fit in the scheme of things. So if I had a non-binding nomination to give my money to Rachel when I died, and I've got a spouse, my spouse would challenge the super fund, and because the super fund knows that actually it should be going to my spouse, they wouldn't pay it to Rachel, they'd pay it to my spouse. They'd make that decision that I must have been coerced or something to pay it to Rachel. So it's not binding on the trustee. When you get to a binding nomination, they are binding on the trustee. Now, there's very strict rules on who can be a binding who you can have as a binding nomination. So have a look on the Money Smart site about what those rules are. But I can't have Rachel as a binding nomination because I have no financial connection with her at all, and she's not one of my children or anything else like that. So I make a binding nomination. So let's just say I have 3 children. I've got 2 children who are here in my house with me, and I've got a love child that no one knows about out there. And I look after the love child, and I look after my 2 children. So when I die, I have a binding nomination to go a third to each of my children. My 2 children who live with me front up to the super fund and say, I'd like to collect the money because I know Mum had me as a binding nomination. And the super fund says, well, actually, Mum had 3 of you as a binding nomination, and we're going to actually find out about the third child. They go off and look at the third child, and the third child has got a financial connection to me, and this third child has because I've been looking after them. Then that third child, it will be legitimately paid a third of my super because I've told them that I'd like them to pay it that way. So the difference between a non-binding and a binding is that if the binding nomination is a legitimate binding nomination, it cannot be stopped. The super fund will pay to those people who you've got as binding nominees.
Thanks for that, Sue. That's really informative. And I guess so there's one more question, and I just want to thank everyone that that's sticking around for the questions. And just to let people know, we've put a link to any feedback that you might want to share with us in the chat. So please provide feedback in that link. So the final question, Sue, is around separation and divorce and splitting super. And the question is there a suggestion on how women can protect their super earnings in divorce or relationship breakups? And perhaps, what the legal rights are, or can you provide some guidance as to where women can get information on their legal rights?
So unfortunately, legal aid will not talk to people about marital splits. So you have to really go and talk to a lawyer. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that when you separate, the assets of the family include all assets, including superannuation. So if your partner has got superannuation and you've got superannuation and you own a home and cars, etc., it goes into what's known as a pool, P-O-O-L, pool, and it is an asset pool. and the asset pool is divided according to the definition of who's getting what. So within within family law, there is certain percentages that one or the other will get depending on the situation. So for instance, in a lot of cases, what happens is when there's a separation, the children go with the woman and the man goes off. And I'm not saying that's every case, but it is with a lot of cases that I work with. So the woman's got the children. The woman has never worked. The husband's been the breadwinner, or the spouse has been the breadwinner, and that person has continued to be the breadwinner. So the court looks at, well, here we've got a woman who's now going to have to perhaps re-enter the workforce, maybe have to enter the workforce part-time because she's still got children that she has to look at, versus the partner who's gone away and is still earning the money, etc. So the family court then look at the pool and they say, right, because the woman is doing much more in the family, then she will be eligible for a bigger amount of the pool. The other issue could be that she may have come into this relationship and the partner brought in assets that will go into all the calculations, etc. So you get, eventually you determine a percentage of the pool. And so let's just say it happens to be 50-50, and the pool with the house, both supers, etc., is $1 million. You then work out who's going to have what for 500,000. So if you want the house and the house is worth 500,000, then the spouse will get everything else, including your super. But if you say, well, the house is only worth 400,000, well, then you could say as part of your thing, you want the super, or vice versa. You might say, I don't want the house, you have the house, and I'll have all the super. So in answer really to your question, your super is not ever in a separation guaranteed that it will stay with you, but it can become part of your pool separation split. And I was just talking to a lady before I came on about a split, and she's splitting and she's getting a part. She's keeping her own super and she's getting part of her former partner's super as part of the split. And it could go the other way too. I have seen women who've had to split part of their super off to their partner. So it isn't something that you can actually say that you definitely want to keep hold of, but you can negotiate with when you are going through the separation and you get a financial separation that is legal, you can negotiate that you keep your super and maybe some of your partners.
Thanks for that, Sue. Really appreciate you answering all these questions. And I just want to thank the audience as well for submitting all these wonderful questions. And I hope that they've been helpful. So I'll hand it back to you now, Annette.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for all those questions. They were great. I was just wondering, Sue, you mentioned you've got some workshops that you're doing in, was it neighbourhood houses? Did you want to let people know about those?
Yes, I did, if you wouldn't mind. I am doing some retirement seminars and also some superannuation deep dive seminars. So in the superannuation deep dive, we go through what does superannuation mean. We actually explore your superannuation statement to ensure that you understand exactly what you can do and what choices you can make. So I do them through an organisation called CIRE Training, which is CIRE, which used to be the old Upper Yarra Neighbourhood House, but has now grown and it now has its own training arm. And we run them during school terms. So for term 4, I'm doing them, the first one starts on the 14th of October, and that's understanding superannuation. And that runs for 5 weeks, 12:30 till 2. So they'll be by Zoom, I would think. I don't think we're going to be doing face-to-face for the rest of this year. Then on the 15th of October, so the 14th is superannuation, and on the 15th is planning for retirement. So a lot of what I've spoken about today, we actually go through and make sure you really understand what the options are and what you can actually learn about planning for your retirement. And that's running from 6:30 till 9 from the 15th of October for 5 weeks. Then I reverse it, and on the 16th of November, I do planning for retirement in the day from 12:30 to 2 for 5 weeks. And I do understanding superannuation at night from the 19th, from 6:30 till 9. So I think Rachel put up the CIRE website, so you can go to cire.org.au. So remembering that CIRE is CIRE, cire.org.au, or you can give the girls a ring on 1300 835 235 and they'll help you with your enrolment process.
That's great. Thank you, Sue. I think that will be an amazing deep dive, and people will come out with a lot of expertise after all of that. So I would like to just say thank you to everybody who has hung around for over this hour, and I hope it's been useful to you. We have, as Rachel said, a link with a very short survey if you would like to click on that, or it will also come out in an email, and just give us some feedback. It helps us to give feedback to the people who fund us. In this instance, it was Manningham Council, and we want to thank them very much for making this available to the community. So yes, if you could please do that. There is also another session tomorrow if you're interested on making smart investment decisions. So that will be on at 12 o'clock, and that's the final in this series. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sue, and goodbye for now.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.